Welcome to Open Door, and I am your host, Bill Effler. If this is your fourth session, gosh, I'm really glad that you've endured me for this time. I hope it's been helpful for you. Again, the backstory for these four teachings, these four segments, was that this is actually a 65-minute presentation divided up into four segments, if you will, on the concept of resilient living. And I have a book coming out. By the time you see this video, it will be out. And the title of that book is Resilient: Tools for Getting Up After Life Knocks You Down. And that's a Penguin Publishing book, and it's available on Amazon, or you can contact me directly if you'd like to do so. So this last session, if you will, this is, I'll just say, is it's the longer of all four sessions. And in this session, I talk about the common things that caregivers and helpers and counselors will encounter when they are trying to help people bounce back or get their life back after they seemingly have lost something. You cannot talk about resilience without knowing that something has taken place in a person's life that requires them to want to get their life back. And that's what resilience is all about. I just want to mention two things that are very common, and we see this in John chapter 11. And that is one of the things that people, and you would think that they would know this, but they don't, is that some people do not recognize dead things in their lives. They're absolutely unaware, that they are clueless on what is going on in their life. That could be a way of denial, or they're just not in touch with reality. A second thing that I would just have you know, and you'll hear this in the video teaching, is that when people have uncomfortable things in their life and they don't want to deal with them, they bury them. That clearly was the case with Lazarus. I mean, the guy had died. And so what do you do with people that die? You bury them. And so Jesus arrives on the scene, late, I might add, and both the sisters, Mary and Martha, both play the blame game and say, if only you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. And so Jesus says, well, remove the stone. Remove the stone away from the grave, and I will have him come forth. And one of the sisters rightfully says, hey, if we remove the stone, there's going to be incredible smell. And she's right. And a third thing that I would have you be aware of is that other than people not being aware that something has died, second idea here is that people bury things that they don't want to have to deal with. But a third element, a third truth here is simply the longer that you wait to deal with something, the more of a stink that there's going to be. So I unpack those things, but there's two other elements, parts of the teaching that I really want to bring to your attention here before I sign off and before you see the actual teaching. And that is that I talk about the importance of community. And in that story, you very clearly see that Jesus does not do for the community what the community can do for themselves. He invites the community to unbind Lazarus. And this is a profoundly important concept when it comes down to community. I think if there's one lesson that or one truth that the COVID virus has tried to teach the churches, that it's okay to not meet together anymore. I think that that's bogus. I think that there is validity to online gathering, but I think that there's some things that you simply cannot get online. I believe that you need to be on time with Jesus. And then a second element here, and I know that in the weeks to come, I'm going to devote an entire section to this, but that is, if you were to look in John chapter 11, you see that Jesus is praying. And I refer to this as prophetic prayer. When I use the term prophetic prayer, I'm talking about that we are praying way beyond our intellectual abilities, way beyond the wheelhouse of our personal experience. But prophetic praying is aligning oneself to God in an incredible way that releases people. Isaiah 61 was Jesus' ordination sermon, if you will, where he said, "The Spirit of God is upon me to release prisoners." And prophetic praying is the type of praying that the helper, the counselor, the intervener, if you will, this person is calling on the Spirit of God to do that which a human simply cannot do. And then the last thing I want to share with you, and I don't want to, rob the punchline here, but I end up closing with a story and something that I've written. And the last thing that I want to say to you about that is that which I wrote and the story that I tell has nothing to do with me, but it has to do with the prophetic work of God in my life. And there's times when God's going to get you up in the middle of the night, as he did with me, to write and to listen. Why? Because there is an assignment down the road for you. And so when we think about removing obstacles, when we think about resilient living, there's going to be certain natural things that are going to come across our path. That is to say, people are clueless about that they need help. People are going to bury things that they should be addressing. But there comes a point in time in a helper's life where you must rely on the prophetic word of God to intervene so people's lives can be set free. So I think I've said enough. I don't want to spoil your video, and I think you'll enjoy it. I certainly enjoyed giving it. Enjoy. God bless you, and bye-bye. These are things, it's right from the text. You know, I was trained as a systematic theologian. I have a Reformed background. My roots of my theology are Presbyterian. My praxis is very charismatic. So what I have relegated myself to is a verse-by-verse systematic of this is what the text is saying, and it's found right here. First, removal reality. People try to bury things in their life. And here's the key thing that I would want you to know about this, is that it is entirely possible to bury something successfully for a season. But the reality is that the truth will come out. In John chapter 8, and you know this text, I've referenced it earlier, and I bypassed it, but in John 8, Jesus says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall..." You know, it really gripes me when people, cite that text, because what they don't realize is that the truth needs to cut deep before it cuts free. People will bury things in their life. Second truth here, dead things that are buried and not addressed will eventually smell. I mean, the sisters are very logical. They're saying, but what about it? I mean, there is a cause and effect, a choice and a consequence here. It's truth. It's going to smell. Your third reality, people closest to a person in pain, in this case it's Mary and Martha, can get in the way of healing. And I'm talking about family members. I mean, I've had to say to moms and dads, family members, I said, you are enabling their illness. You are making my job so much harder because of what you were saying. And, what's going to happen? I was an intake counselor at an 85-bed residential treatment facility, and I had a grandmother come in with her grandson. He was 20-something, and in the facility that I was a part of, the majority of these people were court-ordered. It was either you're going to go to this program, for 15 months, or you're going to do your prison time. Well, what would you choose? Okay? And this grandmother, she's sitting right next to her grandson, and she says, but, gosh, look what's happened here. He's not going to be able to see his son. And you can guess, he's not married. but that doesn't make any difference. You're not going to see his son for these 15 months. I said, that's not true. For first 3 months of his residency, he's not going to be able to see any family member. Why? Because we know that families contaminate healing. It's this point that I'm making here. And she said, but I said, so why is he here? She said, well, he tells me that he was in the garage and he was cooking some stuff with his friends. Well, he wasn't making lobster bisque, okay? And she said, and there was an explosion, and he blew up the garage and lost my car. He's smiling the entire time. The entire time. She goes, what has he got to lose? We lost the garage, we lost the car. And I looked at her straight away and I said, he may need to lose his life. And that's a hard reality. She didn't like that. She goes, and you call yourself a Christian. And I said, and your love is not love at all. And he kind of sat there and went. So he never finished the program. So people can get in the way. Number 4, other people, they're referenced here in the text as onlookers, can also get in the way of transformation. We've talked about people in the church today who audit Jesus and don't follow him. We have thousands of people in church every week. They are committed to attendance, but they're not committed to discipleship. And attendance will do nothing more than make a person miserable. And I know that myself. Yes, Lord. So Greg and I and Living Free, we have this dream of this book coming out in January. And I've been researching in this for a year, writing fiercely since May when I finished up my tenure at Lee. And so I get up early in the morning, and sometimes the Lord gets me up in the middle of the night to write. And so the book, Lord willing, is going to be out in January. But before January, there's some months before that, and we have the month of October, and on October 7th, our youngest is getting married on our property out in the country. She and her fiance came, and Kelly said, you and Mommy got married in Grandpa and Grandpa's backyard. I said, that's right. And Josh said, and my parents got married in their parents' backyard. I went, I know where this is going. They said, can we get married out on the property? How do you say no to that? You're right, you don't. You know what the average cost of a marriage in southeastern Tennessee is today? $27,000. We're not, So for those of you who have daughters or granddaughters, plan. We're not coming anywhere close to that. But anyway, my wife made this comment, and she said, after the book is released, and after the wedding is passed, it will be interesting to see what version of Bill shows up. You laugh. I shared that with a therapist friend of mine. He went, ooh. I said, you want to respond to that? He says, no. But I'm trying to make this point that those people around us, if we're busying ourselves, that gets in the way. Very, very quickly, I already mentioned this. The helper will experience a variety of feelings. This is the reference to Jesus' anger as well as his sorrow. And then verses 41 through 43, and I intentionally blazed through this because I knew I was going to come to this. But verses 41, 42, and 43 is Jesus praying. And the blanks for you to fill in here is that one of the removal realities is that removing stones requires prophetic praying. That is, say, praying beyond your normal focus of thinking or experience. Now, I don't want to turn this into a prophetic conference, and I've spoken at prophetic conferences. My wife and I run in that community. Nashville, Tennessee is a center for prophetic ministry. There are several voices that emerge out of Nashville. and we're familiar with those. But there are some obstacles in life that need a prophetic word. You are not a banker that gives a check. You are not a librarian that gives a book. And you're not a good friend that gives cheap advice. The word incarnational theology is that the word became flesh, and people need you and not just a passing word. If you cannot make a commitment to people, and when speaking a prophetic word, you better be around to help clean up the mess, because it is serious business. But the stone removal reality is that it requires prophetic praying. To remove stones also requires that you identify what binds people. And the text is very clear. Jesus said to them, remove from his hands and feet the grave clothes and unwrap his face. Jesus is very specific. And one of the reasons why people relapse in recovery is because those people that are ministering are not specific enough in removing things that need to take place. You know, heroin is a hideous thing. But I have talked with former heroin addicts who say it's harder for them to get free of nicotine and pot than cocaine or meth. And so we've got to be specific in our intervention with folks. And then lastly, and this is a huge one for me, Jesus does not do what the community could do themselves. If there is ever a verse that is the litmus test for community ministry, that's it. People say, why hasn't God, moved in my life? Well, when was the last time God spoke to you? Do you remember that? I mean, at that time, it was at a concert, a teaching, a workshop. Maybe it was a Sunday sermon. And the preacher was really on fire. And they said, yes. I said, do you remember how God instructed you? And they said, yeah. I said, have you done it? Guess what the answer to that is? No. Write down Revelation chapter 2. And you know Revelation 2 and 3. These are the 7 letters to 7 churches. And that first church off the ticker tape is a church that was not a problem church. It was a church that Paul founded. He loved this church. It was the church at Ephesus. And that word Ephesus, translated from the Greek, means desired one. And if you were to read through Revelation 2, God acknowledges all these things that church has done. And then God says, but I have this one thing against you. What is it? Forsaken your first love. And then he says this. God is so gracious. He not only identifies what the issue is, but he gives an answer to the issue. He says, again, the issue here is you've forsaken your first love. My translation to this, counseling-wise, is you've forgotten your priorities. And the answer to that, it's very practical. Go back and do the things that you did at first. Yeah. I don't know how many times I've talked with couples, and particularly the more aggravation there is, I always begin this way. And I said, just tell me about your relationship. Where did you meet? That's always an interesting question. I said, what got you moved, so in love? And well, he would put notes underneath my windshield wiper, and she would make, my favorite, dessert more than once a month. And then I would ask them, I said, are you still doing those things? Take an answer to what, take a guess on what the answer to that is. The answer is not. Last couple blanks for you to fill in here, and then I close with the story. And you've been most kind in responding, and you just have been. But here are my closing. Before I get to these, you see here it says, the God who lingers and the tragedy of trauma. Greg would remember this, but when we first started this Zooming conference nationwide, we were studying trauma. And they asked me to put some things together because I was the token educator, okay, on what would it look like to have a curriculum on trauma. And the response that came back was, this is too intense. I said, this is our world. This is where we're at. In the last 3 years, we've now had 2 additional definitions on trauma. And that's another teaching for another time. But again, this word resiliency came back, and they say, would you put together a prospectus on what would it look like on a book and a curriculum for resiliency? And that's how he came up with Reboot. I want you to fill in your blank here. You cannot escape the problem that the lingering God creates in the story. Jesus was only 2 miles away. He could have made that journey in less than a half a day, but he waited. This causes a problem for the unbeliever or for those who are struggling. What's taking God so long? Why doesn't he answer prayer? What about that, unborn child that we had, that we lost, which is part of our story? Where was God in this? And Jesus has a way of, one, not showing up when we want him to show up. Jesus also has a way of showing up when we don't want him to show up. But this is a problem, and I'm wanting you to be sensitive that this is something that the barely converted will deal with. And then lastly, you must recognize the need for community as it relates to removing stones. Jesus does not do what the community can do for themselves. I'm going to close with a story. And if you're kind of flagging and kind of tired, I would ask that you try to pull your boots up. It was about 4 months ago, a young woman came into our counseling center, and she was 21, living at home, never married, very squared away, believing girl. And she was engaged to a guy who's 23. He too, still living at home, very squared away, and is a school teacher. But even in her best mainline denominational background, she struggled with panic attacks and anxiety. That was her presenting issue. And so after about 3 or 4 weeks, she came down and she received some tools to receive so she could regulate her emotions. And boy, I thought, she's about ready to graduate. One of my goals as a counselor is to, get people to live independently, dependent on Christ. Independent of me, dependent on Christ. You never want somebody to be dependent on you. Huge. Well, I thought she was about ready to get out of counseling, but there was a terrible shooting up in Nashville in a school, and it totally triggered her. Now, in the book Reboot, we have an entire chapter in there on releasing your triggers, how to identify them, and what they are, and what to do about them. It's a very practical chapter. But that shooting triggered her because her fiance was a school teacher, and we spent another couple weeks trying to regulate her again. And I went to bed one night, and for some of you, this is going to be, man, Greg, he really must have been hard up to get somebody to speak on a Friday afternoon. But anyway, I went to bed one night, and I dreamt. And God speaks to me in dreams. And then he wakes me up. And when I woke up from the dream, I felt like the Lord said, get up and write. And I've had that instruction before. I said, what? Just 2 words, the kite. I don't know how God speaks to you, or if you have any experience with the prophetic, but the prophetic is weird. Okay? If I was a pastor leading a church, I would want the prophets right at my side for 2 reasons. One, they hear from God, but secondly, they can be a little strange. My wife, she goes, how come some of the weirdest people are counselors? I said, thanks a lot, honey. So anyway, I went upstairs where my office is and where Kenny and I Zoom, or Stephen and I Zoom. And I started to draw, and then I started to write, and some stuff came out. And I don't write that way. I tend to write academically and practically. But other stuff started to come out. And I don't know what you call this exactly. So I laid it down, and I came back to it about 2 weeks later, and I polished this up. And I'm going to read to you what I wrote. And it's called The Kite. And I'd like you to think about a 21-year-old girl who's very squared away with the Lord. She's getting married this weekend. The Kite. There was once a multicolored kite. The kite loved climbing high into the sky, especially when there were crystal blue conditions. The kite enjoyed dancing as winds would swell beneath and under her as she would move across the sky. There were times when the dancing created by gusting winds got a little scary for her, but nonetheless the kite enjoyed being a kite for the most part. There was one feature of being a kite that was unpleasant, and that was the attached string. The little kite loved the freedom of flying because she did not like being tethered to the string. The kite often thought, I know better than that old string. And the kite did not realize that there was a direct connection, a relationship between the attached string and her ability to reach higher heights. The kite thought she was doing her own flying, but then one day, the string broke. It took a while, but the little kite crashed to the ground. The kite was overjoyed when the little boy found her. The kite was taken by the little boy ever so carefully and placed into the rafters of a darkened garage. And the kite thought, I really do need the string. Oh, there were still days when the kite would rather be in charge and fly on her own. But in those days, the kite would remember the day that the string broke, and then she would again realize the assuring safety that she had by being connected to the string. It was always late at night, long after the little boy had gone to bed, and letting out a soft sigh, she would say, tomorrow we get to fly again. When I was writing that, I was absolutely oblivious to the genders in this poem. And when she came into the office, I said, I think I have something for you. And so she sat down, she goes, what is it, Dr. Bill? And I read The Kite, and her eyes filled and my eyes filled. And she said, I'm the kite, and you're the little boy. And that's the prophetic. God will take you to a place that you fully are unconscious of, and He will make the unfamiliar become familiar. It will cause a crisis of faith, and it will be up to you to decide, will you deliver the goods?